Welcome to this special PFC webinar to introduce the new PFC Guidance 2001, Chain of Custody of Forest and Tree-Based Products and Related Standards, Guidance for Use. I'm Hannah Prinz, and I'm joined today by Marta Martínez Pardo, our Technical Manager here at PFC International. And Marta is going to take us through the recently published guidance document, explaining how and why it has been developed, what makes it different from some of our past guidance documents, and why that is important for you. If you have any questions, please ask them in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. So, to get started, Marta, could you give us just a brief introduction of this new guidance document?
Thank you very much, Hannah. So this guidance document provides guidance, clarification, or interpretations on the chain of custody standards that were published in 2020, the three chain of custody related standards, which means the main chain of custody standard, the 2002, the trademarks standard, the 2001, and the 2003, which is the CV's requirements standard. And why the three in parallel? Because whenever you are implemented chain of custody, either at company level, you implement both in parallel, the 2002 and the 2001, and when your certification body, your auditor, comes to the company to audit your chain of custody, it needs to follow the 2003. So it was logic that the three standards were revising at the same time in parallel as one block, and that they are implemented as part of the transition period in one block.
Makes sense. So I think it's clear that the target audience for this document is very much chain of custody certified companies, and I would also say certification bodies. Is that fair?
Exactly. That's exactly the objective, the target audience. It was one of the first decisions made by the chain of custody working group. The working group wanted this guidance to be a guidance for people that are familiar with the standards, that are implementing the standards, not for beginners. And that was one of the clear decisions that if, of course, there is need of providing some guidance for beginners, but this should not be part of the content of this guidance document.
Makes sense. I know an important question our stakeholders will have is the transition period. When should they start to use this guidance? Could you maybe give us a little more information on that?
Sure, that's a very good question. The transition period, in fact, it's led by the chain of custody standards. The three related standards have the same transition period, that it was ending the last moment to get an audit against the previous version of the standards was 14 August 2022. From that date onwards, the audits shall be conducted against the revised standards. Since the moment that audits are conducted against the revised standards, this guidance is to be used. This guidance provides clarification to this 2020 version of the standards.
So until you're certified against the 2020 standards, you don't need to move on to this guidance. It's very much for once you're on those standards, or just before, say.
Exactly, or when you are preparing.
Yeah, perfect. We've already mentioned that this guidance document, it's actually a revised guidance document, but my understanding is that it's actually very different from the one that it's replacing. Is that correct?
That's right. That's fairly right. The previous version of the guidance was focused on the chain of custody standard, and it didn't have a target audience for already people implementing the standards. It also covered general guidance for beginners. In addition to that, it was not linked to the requirements in a direct way, as this new guidance is. This new guidance, and this was another objective of the chain of custody working group from the beginning, includes any kind of guidance, clarification, and interpretation. And I think I'm repeating myself with these three terms, which is the scope of the guidance, but of the three related standards. What does it mean? That when you are implementing the standards, when you are using the standards, all clarification, all the information you need to know for the specific requirements, it's available on the guidance. So the text of the standard is the main requirement, of course. Any additional information to this requirement is provided on the guidance document for any of the 3 standards. In addition to that, this new guidance comes with a new format in 2 columns. It's easy to navigate, it's easy to find and to link the requirement with the information because they are one by one. In left column, the requirements, right side column, the information, the additional information. And additionally, what the chain of custody working group, our experts, our chain of custody working group wanted to achieve is to have everything collected in one single document. They wanted to move away from information displayed in I don't know how many different documents that it's very difficult to identify, you don't know where you need to look at. They wanted this to be simple for our users. That's why all the information is in this single guidance. Even if it may be a long guidance, and I hope it does not scare anyone when you face it, you will see quickly that it's very easy to navigate and that it's very easy to identify what goes with each requirement.
So it sounds like it's a really big leap forward in making our guidance documents more user-friendly, much easier for our stakeholders to use.
Indeed, that was a key point. It's much user-friendly, and not only, it also helps to make sure that the standards are implemented in a consistent and harmonized way globally, worldwide, because you have there the guidance. If you need to implement certain requirements and you need to see whether anything else or you have any questions, you go to the guidance, and it doesn't matter if you are based in Mexico or you are based in Italy, you will go to the same document and you will find it there in one single document what the information you need.
Fantastic. So we've spoken quite a bit already about the guidance document itself, but I think it's going to be really interesting to hear more about how this guidance document was developed. And you've already mentioned a few times already the chain of custody working group. So maybe you could give us maybe a few more details on the role of this group within PEFC.
Sure. The chain, and I'm very happy to do this because I work closely with the chain of custody working group. The chain of custody working group represents the different stakeholders that are vital for the implementation of the chain of custody standards and for PFC's role within chain of custody. They are chain of custody experts from different stakeholder groups. Concretely, for the chain of custody working group, we have 5 identified stakeholder groups, and these 5 stakeholder groups have representatives from the chain of custody working group. They are certified scheme users, so companies, and certified PFC scheme users, certification bodies, accreditation bodies, assessors, customers and consumers, such as retailers, for example, that they use the trademarks, and of course they are the ones purchasing finished PFC products and the ones that are, in most cases, closer to the consumer. Civil society, NGOs, environmental representatives from different bodies, and to finish with, our national governing bodies.
Great, thank you for the explanation. Maybe if we go a little bit deeper into the work of the working group, my understanding is that the working groups such as this one have a real key role in bringing different viewpoints into PFC from all the different stakeholders affected by chain of custody, and they work really on building consensus around various chain of custody topics. Is that fair?
That's fair. That's exactly the goal. The chain of custody working group brings together chain of custody experts from these different stakeholder groups with the purpose of providing guidance on the standards, development of new tools and technical documentation related to the chain of custody. It can be any of the 3 standards. And the working group has the objective or the mandate to ensure that PFC's chain of custody requirements are keeping up to date regarding stakeholders' needs, technology developments, and certification demands. So it's bringing the chain of custody, their mandate is to bring the chain of custody close to the needs of the scheme users.
And before we dive into maybe a few more details on how the guide was actually revised, maybe I could just ask quickly, because It's already been mentioned a few times, and I know you might mention it again later in this interview, is you often talk about guidance, clarification and interpretation. Maybe you could let us know what each of these individual things really are, what they mean in this context.
Yeah, that's probably a very good timing for this question, because indeed I mention it a lot and it may not be clear for everybody. So guidance is information. So guidance is quite self-explanatory what it means. Clarification is when we receive a question on the implementation of a requirement, that as soon as there is a question, it means that the requirement may need additional clarification. And it can be solved, and it can reach consensus through the text of the standard. So we use the same text of the standard to clarify this question. This is a clarification. An interpretation, it's provided in those cases where either there is no requirement or the requirement is unclear and it needs additional requirements. The main difference between a clarification and an interpretation is that that interpretation is mandatory and it goes with the wording shall. Whereas clarification is not mandatory, it's more additional information, recommendation, and it goes with the verb should.
Thank you, Marta. I think this might be useful as we move forward with our talk. So maybe you could now explain to us a bit more about the role of the chain of custody working group within the revision process. What steps did they take to get to this new guidance that we have today?
The chain of custody working group had a key role on the development of this guidance document. On any development of technical documents at PFC, we base the work on working groups. The working groups is where the different stakeholders are represented, and that's one of the key deliveries of PFC. Multi-stakeholder working groups that represent the stakeholders from different angles, different scopes.
So how does this group really work? How did they manage to come together and actually come out with decisions with a final document?
That's one of the most important PFC's expertise, is building consensus. That's the main approach. When deciding on the requirements that we will add to a standard, there needs to be consensus among the different stakeholders. And through this consensus, we come up with a standard, with a common language that can be implemented anywhere and understood anywhere, no matter where you are.
So it's clear as part of the development process that the stakeholder feedback is really vital. Could you maybe let us know how you went about that for this specific guidance document?
Sure. We have different tools in place to ensure that any stakeholder's feedback is received and considered by the chain of custody working group. Concretely for this is the case for any standard, but concretely for the chain of custody standard, what we did is, since the 3 standards were published, we started with our new training programs. This enables us to gather feedback and enabled us during these last 2 years to gather feedback from auditors, from NGVs, from companies, and all the feedback that we were collecting through these training programs, through emails, through different communications, were collected in a shape of Q&A to make sure that they were addressed afterwards. In addition to that, whenever we revise a technical document, we look around what are the different feedback to be considered from an advocacy perspective, from different stakeholders, procurement policies. But maybe for this bit, I would like to invite my colleague Torsten to say something about how he conducted the advocacy work to make sure that the guidance covered all what needed to be covered.
So we'd like to welcome Torsten Arndt, our Head of Communications, on to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you so much. Yes, we had a really interesting process in place what we in fact did is we looked at some of those expectations that are ingrained in external processes. For example, right, what do NGOs and civil society say, such as the Accountability Framework Initiative, such as ICEA. But also, quite important, what do governments and governmental bodies say? In this context, we were looking at what is it that the European Union timber regulation requires from certification systems such as PFC. So we were looking at all of these expectations that are out there of stakeholders that don't necessarily participate in our processes because they have other things to do, but that are still important to us because our stakeholders expect us to address those. So we mapped those expectations and included them as much as possible within our guidance document. Does this help you?
Indeed. It helped me within the revision process, and it helps me to introduce the guidance. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome.
Thank you, Thorsten. So I think it's clear that it was a really comprehensive inclusion of stakeholder feedback for this guidance. It's quite impressive, I think. If we look forward, I know that this document is actually going to be a living document, not something static that we don't change, but something that's living. Could you maybe give us an idea of how this is going to work, as I know it's not something that we've done before at PFC?
Yeah. So standards are revised every certain time, but we need to leave some time for our stakeholders to get familiarized with the standards and implemented them. However, in some cases, there can be questions. During this revision process of the guidance, we tried to address all the questions that we received. However, we are aware that we will receive more questions, and we hope that we will receive more questions because it's the way to improve our requirements and our documents. So the idea is having this guidance as a living document, because I mentioned before that one of the objectives is that this guidance helps us ensuring a consistent and harmonized implementation worldwide. So if there are questions coming that need to be addressed by our chain of custody working group and provide clarification, what we will do is, when these questions have a global scope and are important to know for all our stakeholders, we will add them in the guidance regularly. Not meaning regularly like once per month, but the idea is putting in place a new procedure that allows us to update this guidance every certain time, maybe once per year. And of course, publishing a new text indicating what's new and making it easy to identify the new guidance, clarifications and interpretations provided.
I can imagine this is going to be something that's incredibly useful to our stakeholders, because they know that they're always going to get the most up-to-date clarification, interpretation and so on. So I can see this being a really fantastic benefit of this new guidance document.
I hope so, it's the intention.
So maybe now we can dive in and look at some of the clarifications, some maybe specific clarifications in the requirements of these 3 chain of custody related standards. Are there any maybe that stand out, some you'd really like to share with us today?
Yeah. But first, just a warning to you and to all of you listening and seeing us today, that I can become too technical and talking too technical terms. If this happens, please stop me and do not hesitate to send your questions through the Q&A, and I will try to be less technical and use less technical language, because this happens sometimes. That is my regular work. So let's start by something that probably it's interesting for many of our certified companies and the certification bodies operating our standards: outsourcing agreements. We realized during the chain of custody working group meetings that we received quite a lot of questions regarding outsourcing. So the guidance includes some information to clarify how outsourcing activities shall be audited as part of the internal audits. Without entering in too many details here, so I would just invite you to go
to the guidance and read these clarifications, I can just give you an example. In cases where outsource activities are conducted by multiple outsourcees, the guidance clarifies that, of course, the internal audit needs to cover all those outsourcing companies. However, it can be conducted through a sampling, the same sampling as we use for multi-sites.
Fantastic. Maybe one of the other things that has come up that I've heard about is more about the chain of custody system-specific standards.
Yeah, some clarification. First of all, let's clarify what a chain of custody system-specific is.
Yes.
So in some cases, PFC also endorses chain of custody standards from some of our NGBs, our national governing bodies. For those cases, PFC has requirements on how the claims of the system-specific chain of custody standards are compatible with our claims. The guidance clarifies that the PFC official claims are to be used whenever there is trade between a system-specific certified company and a PFC international chain of custody certified company. The guidance clarifies how this process works and the equivalence between the different claims.
And what about the PFC official claims?
Yeah, the guidance also tackles the PFC official claims and includes any accepted translations and abbreviations to the 3 PFC official claims, so PFC certified, 100% PFC origin, and PFC controlled sources. And it also indicates how these official claims can be used in different languages and in which context companies may use a translated claim or may use the official English chain of custody claim.
I know a lot of effort was put into the controversial sources definition. Maybe you could give us a little bit more about that.
Indeed, lots of work done on the controversial sources definition, and concretely for this definition, what the feedback or what we considered is the study conducted on behalf of the European Commission on EUTR implementation, the one that my colleague Torsten referred to earlier. And it was important to us to clarify during this study some questions were raised regarding our controversial sources definition and the legislation coverage. So the legislation that was covered under the wording of our controversial sources definition. So what we clarified in this guidance is what is to be understood as legislation covered under this controversial sources definition and that companies and material need to comply with.
And what about DDS or due diligence system implementation?
Yeah, that goes hand by hand with the controversial sources definition, and again, lots of efforts and energy from the chain of custody working group on this one. Just to give you a few examples. Something that is clarified on the guidance is content of self-declarations and how self-declarations can be used for the purpose of the implementation of the DDS. The DDS, on the step of the risk assessment, the DDS, the guidance provides further clarification on the implementation of certain indicators for those of you very familiar with the chain of custody, table 2 of the appendix 1 of the chain of custody. And that's probably when I'm becoming too technical.
It might be.
Sorry about that. But maybe like this, everybody now feels invited to go to look into the guidance. That is the main purpose. So.
It's a nice taster.
Something else that the guidance clarifies, apart that, in fact, it was not touched during the last revision process, risk mitigation. And through the questions that we received, we realized that on the risk mitigation section, there are some questions to clarify, and that's what we did. An example is for the sampling, the on-site inspection sampling. That's something that the chain of custody working group and a few colleagues specifically working on countries where they are obliged to conduct the risk mitigation because material it's that it comes up with a high likelihood to come from controversial sources, they put in place certain clarifications to make the life of users of this material easier when implementing our requirements. And also, the guidance clarifies that the risk mitigation is to be implemented for the identified risks. So we don't need to implement risk mitigation for all the indicators on table 2, again, too technical. But now I know that all of you are looking at the standard at the same time as watching us. So and that only those risks that have been identified as high risk need to be mitigated.
Maybe we can jump to something a little different and maybe look at the trademarks. And I know there is something different regarding the definition of retailers.
Yeah, and I think that's something that will help many of of those end users of our finished products. So what it clarifies, the trademarks standard includes a definition for retailer that is associated to specific requirements for the usage of the trademarks when it's on finished products. What we clarified in this guidance is that by retailer, we want to have an extended definition. So by retailer, we cover any company procuring and selling PFC finished products that does not manipulate the products in any way. So it receives a PFC finished product and sells it, puts it on the market. Those are the eligible companies to be a retailer and to implement the requirements for retailers.
Perfect. And last, but definitely not least, certification body requirements. Are there anything specific in the guidance to highlight for them?
Indeed, a few things. I need to say, and through these questions and how I'm answering on the clarifications, most of the clarifications and the guidance are on the chain of custody standard. We don't have yet many on the trademarks standard and the CV's requirements standard. However, there are a few that are important. For example, a few related to the scope of the certificates. The guidance clarifies that in the case of producer groups, the scope needs to be defined for each of the individual participants in the producer group, because a producer group is a group of entities, a group of companies that may have different scopes. And until now, this was not clarified. In addition, the guidance also clarifies for the certificate scope, that when species are something that defines the product, they need to be also included. And one more thing to highlight on the CV's requirements, without wanting to provide you with a lot of information, because I think it's better to go directly to read the guidance and to listen to me. Another one that is important, the guidance clarifies that when the non-conformity is related to an infringement of legislation, it needs to be classified as a major non-conformity. And to finish with the CV's requirements, I would not like to forget about one that it's also quite important on these new standards and on the implementation, and that companies will see that it's new, is the certificate number. The revised standard have requirements on how the certificate number shall look like, and this guidance document provides further details for certification bodies to know how this certificate number is to be implemented.
Thank you very much, Marta. I think it's really interesting to hear just some of the new clarifications that are in this new guidance document. But as you say, I think probably the best way to see them is to see the document yourself. But I think it's great to get that overview. I know something that may come up, some people may ask, is about project certification, because I believe that isn't currently covered in the new guidance document. But is this something that may change in the future?
You are right. Project certification was part of the previous guidance document, but it's not part of this guidance document. However, this is one of the future scopes of the chain of custody working group. So for now, the current requirements for project certification are those on the previous guidance, and they can still be used. The chain of custody working group is working on that. So in the following month, we will publish new requirements for project certification that will replace the previous ones, the existing ones.
Brilliant. So that really brings me on quite nicely to my last question, and it's quite a simple one, and that is, what are the next topics planned for the Chain of Custody Working Group?
For sure, they will carry on providing guidance, interpretations and clarifications. You really see how much I like these 3 words, big words. It's maybe what everybody's going to remember after this webinar.
Yeah. We may test you.
So they will continue their work. And there are a few topics we want to further work on. Project certification, of course. Recycle material, PFC's definition for recycled material. DDS, controversial sources definition, and specifically studying different ways to make life of small holders, small companies from countries that may not be eligible to be low likelihood of risk, to make it easier that they can access through PFC certification and implement our requirements.
So great, thank you very much, Marta. It's clear to see there's still a lot of work ahead, but clearly a huge amount of work has already been done. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and of course thank you, Marta, for taking us through this guidance document, and also Torsten for jumping in to explain his part. And we'd also like to give a really big thank you to the members of the working group for their time, for their dedication, because we really couldn't do this work without them. And we'd also like to thank Suzette Weeding, who is the chair of this group. So without you guys, we wouldn't be where we are today. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone, and we can now move over to the questions and answers session of this webinar.